start with that. Thanks everyone for having me here. My name is Vivek Srivastava. I joined Digital Asset a year and a half back, primarily in tech sales, client engineering side of things, which essentially means that you get to meet the clients, you get to inform them about our products, as well as do POCs and sometimes run trainings. Prior to that, I had my own startup in the LT space for a year, and before that, I worked at Citigroup for 13 years across New York and London. In the last role, I was managing all of their exchange connectivity globally for equities, which essentially means that all the trading that happens in city equities was going through the systems that I managed, as well as I was a co-founder for an internal startup as part of City Venture. So in the this session today, the two things I'll primarily focus on is DAML, which is our smart contract language, and DABL, which is our ledger as a service offering. Again, if you guys do have questions, given the technical difficulties, it might be best to let Charles know, and he can type in, and I can answer them. Otherwise, I will just proceed unless Charles interrupts me with the session. Okay. So we'll quickly go over some introduction to DA and DAML. So Digital Asset, it's a tech company, and our mission is to fundamentally change the way distributed applications are built and deployed. What I mean here is primarily if you think of traditionally how distributed applications are built, if you take any tech project, I would say a lot of the work that goes in these tech projects are non-differentiated work or undifferentiated work. It's not necessarily adding business value, as well as the time to market is always a pain, right? So if you are on the business side, you know that it's very hard to get a really good time to market from the tech teams. So some of these challenges are they get even more amplified if you are talking about in a DLT space. And these are the areas where Digital Asset as a tech company and our product really shine. So a quick history of Digital Asset. It was founded in 2014 by Don Wilson and three co-founders in Chicago. In later some time, we acquired a few companies, Hyperledger, one of them. We gave the brand name to Linux Foundation. And since then, basically, many of you might have be aware of Hyperledger Foundation and multiple projects under that umbrella. As we grew 2017, we raised some funding in between, and 2017 was a changing point from our history perspective because we won the Australian Securities Exchange chest replacement project, which essentially means that that project is a multi-year program because it's a systematically consequential system replacement. That is timed to go live next year Q1. So the member firms of Australian Securities Exchange are already testing the new system, and there's a year-long testing basically time frame because the nature of it, which essentially means that when the system goes live, everything that is getting traded in Australia as a cash equity, it will get settled and cleared on this new system. In 2018, we started to work with Hong Kong Stock Exchange, primarily on their northbound connect flow, which is essentially from overseas trading mainland China, from Hong Kong, Shenzhen, and Shanghai. In 2019, so what happened basically all this while was that we had our own full stack solution, which essentially means that we had our own ledger, we had our own smart contract language, and we were building applications for our clients. In 2019, that changed. We open sourced our smart contract language, and we made it portable to multiple ledgers, which essentially means is that we are not in the ledger business anymore. We work with our ledger partners, and we basically ensure that DAML is available on multiple ledgers. In 2020, earlier this year, we announced our Series C funding, and Salesforce and Samsung were the two key tech investors that joined our investor pool. Okay, let's start with contracts. So this is a definition of contract on Wikipedia. Some of the key things here to note is that it talks about various parties involved. It talks about their rights and duties. It talks about that a contract is, in most cases, in exchange of goods, service, money, or promise. And the key aspect here, it talks about there's a mutual intent to be bound, which essentially means that you have to have consent from all the parties. So, excuse me, that's the definition of contracts. And let's take some key attributes and what are the desirable properties of contracts if you want them to act like a smart contract. So again, the attribute side of things, it's voluntarily agreement between two or more parties. It must be signed by all the parties. It again defines the rights and obligations, which is essentially kind of the rule book that the various parties share. And then you have the option to exercise those rights and obligations in the future. Some of the desired properties are temporal resistance, understandable, and how the terms and conditions basically define the rights and obligations to whoever the signatories are. So an example could be that when you define the rule book of the game of chess, that can be considered as a contract, or if you are using basically the in DLT terms, you can implement that as a smart contract. Okay. Another example of would be of a contract, and which again, if it has the desired properties, it will be a smart contract. Is my employment contract, for example. So when I joined, or rather before I joined, Digital Asset proposed that basically the role. I agreed to it. We had a contract, and then as part of that contract, there are certain rights and obligations. So, for example, Digital Asset has the obligation to pay me. I have the right to claim expenses. I have the right to resign. And Digital Asset has the right to fire me, and Digital Asset has the right to promote me. So what we're talking about here is ultimately, when you look a bit deeper into any of these contracts, we are talking about rights and obligations of various entities involved. So why smart contract technology and DLT? So if you look at any business, it's really irrelevant of the industry, right? Businesses in general, they rely on multi-party workflows, whether that's to manage inventories, to do some transactions, to track and trace, or if to claim processing, anything. And you'll have, at this point, basically, if you're using the traditional technology, the various members, basically, whether it's member firms or if there's a significant party, which we often can pick up as market operator, they all use different technologies to trade and settle, right? Now, whether that's in financial domain or in any other domain, right? There's no common data model across basically these member participants, and definitely there's no shared workflow, like shared rules of business. A lot of them, they do exist, but they're on paper. They're not machine executable, right? And in a sense, what happens is that every entity is interpreting these rules based on what they understand, they implement it, excuse me. And then when they start to transact with each other, they essentially have their own data silos, and you will end up a lot of basically reconciliations, right? So now what we'll cover in the next section would be how DAML and basically the technology that are built by Digital Asset, how we tackle some of these problems. So let's start with DAML. So what is DAML? DAML is an open source smart contract language, which essentially has one aim to get developers really productive without compromising on risk, without compromising on the security and safety side of things, right? Excuse me. It's built on the building blocks of rights and obligations, and you can define any multi-party business workflow in DAML. And on top of that, what's the most important bit is that the privacy is built in. So you do not necessarily need to think outside the box on how do I make sure that my data privacy requirements are met. So, and I don't think that the time will permit today, but if maybe we can have a separate follow-up meetup, or you can join one of the follow-up meetups that we'll be hosting, where we will have some hands-on coding examples, and you will see like DAML in action. So the reason why DAML was created is because if you really want to build secure distributed applications using a general purpose language and trying to build them is hard, it's error prone, and it's time consuming. So we often take the example of if you want to really build a house model, a model of a house, right? If you use clay, you really need to be very good modeler to build a very good model of a house. But if you use like things like Lego pieces or similar building blocks, it's a lot easier. And the reason why it's easier is because these building blocks have restrictions built in. You cannot just basically put any piece wherever you want to. There are building blocks, and then you follow the recipe, and then you end up having basically making these models. Similarly, DAML is a domain-specific language. It's deliberately restricted to solve specific problems in a predictable manner, and it has native constructs built in the language, which are basically domain-specific. So using DAML, we solve two problems, essentially. The first one is that excessive development time, your developers, your technologists' time, is spent today on undifferentiated work, which do not add any business value today. So if you, for example, if you have been involved with any of the tech projects, it doesn't matter whether it's new tech, old tech, irrelevant. I would say somewhere between 70% to, in the worst case scenario, maybe even 90% work that is done on these projects is pure like plumbing related, right? It's not that that work is not needed. Now, examples of this could be your database schema definition, your rules and entitlements, your how it will get how to segregate the data, things like that, right? And how to basically make it work with the underlying persistence layer, right? And the rest is basically the business value add, which is the time spent on that is really small, right? So what DAML tries to do is that it works towards short circuiting essentially this 70% work. So the work is done, and because as I said, to make the system work properly, you really need to get all that working, okay? You need to have the privacy aspect, you need to make sure that the right person can see or act on the data properly, things like that, right? It's just that it is done behind the scene for you. And that essentially means that your developers now are focusing purely on the business logic. And what that translates to business is time to market. So that's the first problem we aim to solve using DAML. The second problem, again, if you have been involved in any of the tech projects, is that if you have been involved in, so let's say, for example, migrating from Sybase to Oracle, or from IBM MQ to TIBCO, or like similar projects, right? What normally happens is that you will hire a consulting company, and they will basically come in, they will do the research, and they will propose a 2-year transformation project. I'm sure anyone who has been in business that deals with tech has been through that journey. So the other aspect here, what DAML really shines at, is that the piece of code, the application that you have written using DAML, you can choose whether you want to run it against a database, against a distributed ledger, against a blockchain, and you can move that application basically from a database to a blockchain without a single line of code change. So, for example, if you have built you have implemented all your business logic, and today you want to start with a database and you want to go to a blockchain tomorrow, or you started with a blockchain, for some reason the company did not do any good, you want to migrate to a different blockchain. Today, if you are not using DAML, you will most likely end up rewriting, if not all, bulk of your application again. But using DAML, you do not need a single line of code change to achieve that. And that, what that gives you is optionality. What it gives you is avoids the vendor locking. It also gives you a much more important freedom, which essentially is that you can actually do all your business logic development. Using DAML, you can prove the business case first before even thinking about how do you want to deploy it. And that is very powerful. So, excuse me. Again, some of the DAML features. If you think of what DAML really at the core of it, what you do, you end up defining a data model first. So again, if you want to, go on the digital journey, ultimately you will be modeling something, and you will be representing that, whether that's an asset, that's a workflow, in some form of data, right? So the first thing is you define your data model. Second, you define the data governance model. So who can do what when? So who can take action on it, who can see it, who can transform it, and things like that. Using your data model and your data governance model is basically your business logic is already defined. Okay. Now, the using DAML, because it's it's a functional language, it has a lot more other benefits. Things like you can analyze it mathematically, so you can actually know all the outcome of your code. So what are the various paths that it will take. On top of that, what Digital Asset has done really well is that as part of our SDK tooling, the software development lifecycle feedback loop, right, is very, very tight. So, for example, if you have been in tech, you must have heard this, that if you find a problem in development, the cost of fixing that versus finding a problem in production, and cost of fixing that is exponentially different. So with DAML SDK and the tooling that comes with it, your feedback loop is very tight. So the tightest feedback loop is that if you are doing a test-driven development, you get to see the impact of the change of the code in real time. And you have other tools where you can do all of your functional testing, your integration testing, on your laptop or on a simple machine. And then the only time you really have to deploy and test things on the real persistence layer is when you want to do your non-functional testing. Okay. So let's see how do we, what does it all mean when it comes to DAML? And we talked about the smart contracts, and we talked about portability and all that, right? So first thing is, as I said before, DAML is built on the building blocks of rights and obligations. So if you think of, what is a market? If you take a slice of any market, you will have multiple entities involved. So there are market players or market members. And at any given point of time, they will have certain rights and obligations. So, for example, if you own an equity, you have certain rights. If you're an issuer of that equity, you will have certain rights. If it's let's say, if it's an insurance use case, if you are an insurance provider, you have certain rights based on the agreement that you expect some payments versus the person who's insured. They have the right to make claims and things like that. So at the and this is where the building blocks are very important, because DAML is built on these rights, building blocks of rights and obligations. Now, what happens is when you are writing DAML smart contracts, you are defining the rule books, right? You're defining what are these rights and obligations of various entities involved. So, for example, in this case, in this example, on the left-hand side, you see that something called template. So a template is, if you like, what's a template? If you think of like a rental scenario, the piece of paper where you have all the terms and conditions written between the landlord and the tenant, and that's essentially the rule book. That's what you write on DAML. So that's basically, you create templates to define those terms and conditions or define that rule book. Okay. On the top of it, in this case, it is modeling equity. So it says that the data model essentially is, it has an issuer, it has an owner, quantity, ticker, CSD, and a regulator. And then you define the rights and obligations of the choices. So for this, in this case, the issuer, for example, can split it, the owner can transfer it, the owner can vote, and the issuer can pay dividend, right? Now, when the transactions start to happen, you create contracts. And so if you think of, like, so far I have not talked about like anything about the underlying ledger, how things are signed, how things are encrypted, how things are persisted, because all of that is really undifferentiated work. And that's the beauty of DAML, that you really focus on purely business logic and nothing else. This is a code. So on the left-hand side, you see the DAML code, which essentially models an asset. In this case, so you see the definition of a template of type asset with certain fields, and then you define who's a signatory. So these are basically, remember what I said about the building blocks when we're talking about the language and the Lego versus clay analogy, where so signatory is a built-in construct in DAML. So when you define basically a signatory, what it means is that their consent is required to create that kind of a contract. So in this case, unless you have consent of the issuer and the owner both, you cannot create a contract which is of type asset. Now think about it, if you have to really do that in any other language, it will need a lot more coding and a lot more checks and balances to do that. Versus in DAML, it's because of the building blocks, it's already defined. If you define them as signatory, the consent is must. You can, if in your use case, if you think that there's a need for an entity to have basically to view certain kind of contracts, you can define them in observer. Now in DAML, it's one line code change. So if you define them in observer and they basically subscribe on the API or they have a node, they will get a copy of basically they will get the data gets synchronized, and they will have a view of all the contracts where they are observers. Or you can define entities as as controllers, which essentially mean that they can transform, they can take action, they have the rights and obligations to do something, right? So in this case, the owner can propose transfer. Now, some of the key things here to really note are that DAML is built on the principle of least privilege. So if you are not a stakeholder, which essentially means that if you are not a signatory, observer, or a controller, you will never see that contract. It's built in. As a developer, you don't need to define anything else. It's done behind the scene for you. The other aspect is that, so again, you define your data schema, you define the data ownership, you can define constraints, you can define the read and write control. Now, as part of these transformations or these choices, these are atomically executed transformations, which means that if you have multiple actions there, either all of them will happen at the same time or none of them will happen. So this comes quite handy when you have multiple sub transactions or sub actions as part of one choice, and you need to ensure that all of this happen together. Otherwise, basically, this is not a valid transaction, for example, right? Now, again, if you have to do that in any traditional language, you have to think about rolling back. You have to think about keeping track of things. But all of that, basically, you don't need to do that in DAML. So, again, DAML is an open source tool which gets you productive. It essentially means that it's not the way DAML is developed. It's not like an incremental improvement. And what we have seen is that from our clients and our partners, they have reported 10 times productivity gains in their development team using DAML. And all the tooling and basically the language itself is developer driven. So the other aspect is that the developer experience is very, very rich, and which translate to business terms is that you can transform your existing business, or you can basically get that time to market really short, which means that you can achieve your business goal quickly. Okay, I will pause for a second for any questions before we move to the next section. Charles, let me know if there are any questions.
Just tell me, I'll type it.
Okay. Could I ask him how would demo work in Ethereum? Because transactional finality is not.
Okay, I do not see any questions coming in here.
Transactions work with Ethereum.
Okay, let's move on to the next section, where we talk about optionality and portability. So if you look at, again, the industry trend in the DLT space, right? 4 or 5 years back, everyone started with their own full stack, right? You have your own smart contract language, you have your own ledger, even some folks implemented their own persistence like data stores and all that, right? And then you had a lot of applications being built. What we have seen is that the bottom 2 layers are becoming more and more commoditized plug and play. And also, the business value add is lower towards the bottom stack, right? Versus on the top and where we are talking about the business logic, which is that's application or in the smart contract, it's a lot more niche, and the business value add is a lot more. And that's one of the reason I would say is where like we focus on the smart contract layer using our language DAML. Now, when you write a ledger agnostic application, you get the freedom to pick and choose the ledger, or you as well as basically avoid the vendor lock-in, right? You can change your ledger over time if you want to. The key benefit here again is that your application is written once, and you can redeploy it based on the needs as per of your persistence layer. Now, those are primarily driven by your non-functional requirement, your trust assumptions, and things like that. Okay. So these are some of the ledgers where DAML is integrated with. So VMware blockchain, Hyperledger Sawtooth, Hyperledger Fabric, Hyperledger Besu was announced last week, Corda R3, Amazon Aurora, which is and Postgre, both are databases, as well as Amazon QLDB, which is the quantum ledger from Amazon, which is kind of a immutable, append-only, encrypted ledger. So again, and the list is growing. All this is driven from the based on the client demands. The key things are about the de-risking the technology choices. So if you are in a role which is a decision-making role, you can prove your business case very quickly before you even have to think about which ledger, which platform we really want to use. Okay. These are some of the success stories from the enterprise in public domain. Australia Securities Exchange we talk about, Hong Kong Exchange we talk about, ISDA, which is an association in derivatives space. We work with them. Broadridge, they are launching their repos on DAML. BNP Paribas and HSBC. Again, these are our clients in public domain. All of them are leveraging DAML, and they are in different stage of their journeys. We do have clients in healthcare and in supply chain, but that's not in public domain at this point. So what's the best way to get started? Go to docs.daml.com. You can download the SDK, and you develop, play with it, and you can do demos. Uh, Now that's primarily on the DAML, and as I said, if you had longer session, I would have loved to do hands-on, live coding and launching DAML-driven application in front of you, but maybe some other time. So far, we talked about how we can quickly develop the applications, right? Now, what's the next challenge? What's the next hurdle in technology space? It's about how do we deploy it, how do we run it, and things like that. And this is where DABL comes handy. So it's a ledger as a service offering. It's a platform to deploy your application in seconds. We have a YouTube video where you go from compiled to fully deployed application in, I believe, excuse me, 7 minutes or so. And normally, if you think about basically how long does it take to actually do it, even in development, forget about production, right? If you want to get a VM to secure a VM or to then deploy the database, deploy the backend, this that, it's painful. We are heavily influenced by the gentleman, where we think that in the future is basically where any developer who is writing code, it's all business logic, and the rest of the things are taken care of behind the scene for you, right? So the developers don't have to go through that pain again and again. So some of the benefits, and again, what is good here is that the next two slides you will see. So this is the Kanban, basically project roadmap for DABL. It is written in DAML and it is hosted on DABL. So it's kind of eating your own dog food kind of thing. And it just shows that how easy it is to build and deploy. You can go from your idea to production fairly quickly. This was done by one person in the team, and it took them ballpark a week time frame. And we have basically, you can create projects, you can create a full Kanban board, and you can start tracking. That's another application which we have open source, which again similar time frame it took. This is like a kind of a chat, or rather like a Slack-like application built in DAML, deployed on DABL. Again, it's all about basically that. Okay, now you have built your application, how quickly you can go live. And if you have built your DAML models, if you have built your GUI, it takes minutes. So the key thing here is, again, that the developers do not need to struggle with the infrastructure, right? Because as we said earlier, creating a VM, installing a database, permissioning it, creating users on that, all that is undifferentiated work. None of that adds any business value. And our focus and passion is all about that productivity gain, and basically get our business users to market very, very quickly. More importantly, it's the consistent approach, which essentially means that you can build your application in DAML, you can actually do stakeholdering fairly quickly, and you can work out your developer experience is exactly the same. And you do not need to have that decision made up early upfront, whether you want to go for ledger X, ledger B, whether you really want a DLT, or you can basically, the business case really can be get most value from a database itself. More importantly, it's about time to market. So these are some of the key things, and obviously, when you have these powers of implementing your ideas quickly, developing your applications quickly, deploying them fairly quickly, it works for all. It's a win-win for everyone involved. These are some of the partners that we basically get involved with, who write DAML code for our clients. Again, they get involved in different stages of the project. And as I said, to get started, you go to daml.com, and if you want to know about enterprise solutions, go to digitalasset.com. We do have very active blogs on DAML driven, or if you want to contact, you can contact me or Debbie, who is my colleague here in London. Thank you.